if you look at the phenomenon in itself, that it's clear that intelligence doesn't play a role.
I'm asking you, I'm imploring you. I think you have an obligation to at least ask questions, to raise some doubts.
My name is Germ. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas, and what a great way to start 2022. I am joined by Mike Yeadon and Mattias Desmet. Thank you, gents, for joining me in the trenches.
Happy New Year.
Is it a Happy New Year?
It's difficult, but I'm in a better place than I was. I'm in Florida, by the way. I call it running towards the sound of the guns, because we are going to prevail, eventually, humans, and hopefully before we reach the last stand in Alamo. Well, we're going to win this time, but anyway, you get the idea. I decided not to stay in the UK because I was worried that they might get to stupid things like border closures and stupidity about vaccine passports sooner than I wanted. So anyway, I thought I'd be somewhere where I felt I could keep battling for as long as is needed. That's why I'm here.
I guess the same holds for me. I don't believe the process we are in will stop immediately, but I will continue to speak out, and I have the impression that there are more people now that start to speak out, but at the same time, probably the mainstream narrative or the system might become more repressive, might become more aggressive in a certain sense, because I don't know any or systems and ideologies tend to use their power when they start to feel threatened, and I guess that is what will happen in this situation as well. So, well, I'm hopeful in the sense that you see that people become more aware of that there is something a bit wrong with the narrative, or even a lot wrong with the narrative, and I guess maybe in a few years, I believe we might get rid of the psychological problem we are dealing with now.
Yeah, I was just walking with my wife before we came on this program, and because she was quite angry with me. I've been a bit stressed in the last 24 hours because I foolishly managed to get 4 interviews in a row. So it means I have not had a day to kind of settle my mind or spend any time with her. And unfortunately, I tend to be an anxious person, which is just an awful characteristic. One of the pros of anxiety, if you're an inquisitive person, and that's probably why it's helped me, is it makes you think over and over and over again. So it means I improve at things, but it makes me impossible to be with. And it's no fun in my head either. So anyway, so she was quite angry and said, you must not do this back-to-back stuff because it's no good for you and it's no good for me. Anyway, so we were walking, and I said, you are right. I want to rush at this and speak out, as Mattias says. I'll just blow up if I try and do multiple interviews. I'm not going to survive. So I want to try and make them more effective, and so maybe we could turn to that. No one wants to hear me telling you about the government's lies. I hope if you're even half conscious, you know that at least something that's important about your health is completely wrong, and they shouldn't be. And if they're lying about that, why would you believe anything else they're telling you? And so, for me, the recent realization that Mattias, I think, has brought into the world, that when we've thought people acting almost as if they're hypnotized, and we realized, they really are. And I've come across, well, my sister Jane is a PhD biologist, and I haven't seen her for a long time because she lives in Australia. She's been there for about 40 years. I can't persuade her at all. She thinks I've been captured by aliens, is her expression. Whereas, whereas 8 of my family members in UK and Europe, they all believe me because I've spoken to or seen them regularly through 2020. And then the guy that was the head of the UK vaccine task force, a guy called Dr. Clive Dix, I met him. He was a senior guy at Glaxo when Glaxo bought Wellcome. And I remember amusingly, he took too long to come to me. So by the time he got to me for what was called the fireside chat, I'd already taken a job at Pfizer. So I let him spend 15 minutes selling the company to me, and then I told him that I already had a job, and he wasn't pleased. But we parted on good enough terms. So I remember thinking he must be a clever bloke because he's 3 levels higher than me. But last year, I had an interaction with someone who knows him well, and it's absolutely clear to me he's no idea what's going on. I don't think
Mm.
he's faking it. I think so he's one
No,
of
no, no.
Matthias. He's one of Matthias's mass. What else? And you know, I love them to come to me if I've. So I have not said anything bad about Clive Dix. You know, then Kate Bingham. She was once known as almost the queen bee of London venture finance. Very clever woman, very accomplished. I pitched to her fund, which she ran maybe 8 years ago, and she was not convinced, didn't invest. Of course, we did actually eventually make a lot of money. So tough luck, Kate. But again, very clever woman. She was in charge of the vaccine task force. I don't believe for a moment that she has any idea that she's helped purchase toxins. I don't think she does. And so it seems to me intelligence and knowledge are no defense at all against this process, Matthias.
Mm.
In fact, it's worse. I think you almost kid yourself. You know, you understand, and so immediately you line up with the intelligentsia, and you kind of make excuses for things that don't fit. I probably did that for my entire life until a year and a half ago. I have described myself as a normie. I spent 41 years listening to BBC Radio 4. 41 years. 41 years. And I don't listen to it anymore. It's all nonsense. Anyway, you know, I'm tired of beating on the drum of, you know, it's all not true. What part of you're being fooled are you not getting? And there's got to be a more subtle way of doing this. Yes, actually, what I was going to say when I was walking is I said to my wife, do you know, this could go on for years. I think whoever's running this or whatever's running this has probably got sufficient patience to run us into the ground if we let them. So maybe this becomes a part-time job for the next 8 years.
Matthias, I thought a great way to get your engine started is a quote that I read by Carl Jung. And forgive me if I get it slightly wrong, but he said something along the lines of the greatest threat to mankind is not disease or natural disaster, but our inability to deal with our own psyche. Do you agree with that?
Oh yes, of course. The greatest and the most dangerous enemy is in ourselves, and then I agree. Yes, like that. In the beginning, in the very beginning of the crisis. Give me a minute. In the beginning of the crisis, in the first week of the crisis, I wrote this opinion paper, uh, which was titled "The Fear of the Virus is More Dangerous Than the Virus Itself." And
Mm.
exactly that's what we see, and I can only confirm what Michael was telling, that I see constantly very intelligent people, highly intelligent people, who in a miraculous way are not able anymore to see that the counting of the number of contaminations, hospitalizations, the number of casualties claimed by the virus is actually uh, leads to a dramatic overestimation of the dangerousness of the virus. That's only one example, but I see it constantly around me. People who have a PhD in statistics, for instance, and who, in a almost incomprehensible way, cannot see the major mistakes that are constantly made at the level of the figures and the stats and the mathematical models in this crisis. So and indeed, it has a lot to do, I think, if you analyze this. Maybe some people, uh, some people willingly manipulate the figures, but most experts in this crisis just are in the grip of a psychological process that makes them blind and unable to see what is evident. And uh, that has everything to do with the way in which they handle their own anxiety and their own fear. And if we we could say if you handle your fear and your anxiety in the wrong way, then you end up in a very dangerous state as a society. And in that respect, I definitely agree with Carl Gustav Jung, who said that this is more dangerous than a disease. Yes.
Matthias, I know that I think you are not a fan of that term psychosis in the phrase that Robert Malone used on Joe Rogan's show when he said mass formation psychosis. What is the reason for not liking the term?
Ah, yes. I talked about this with Robert. We had a podcast which started with a discussion of the term, and indeed I wouldn't use it. And I have problems with the term psychosis, or I don't use the term psychosis because to me it seems that it is both from an ethical, a pragmatic, and an intellectual perspective problematic. So the ethical thing is this: uh, it's not a good idea to diagnose people, I think, in such a situation because a large segment of the population is indeed in a state, I think, that can be compared to hypnosis. But the other people might be in a in a problematic, or some other people might be in a problematic state as well. I don't think that we should stigmatize one group by using a diagnostic term. That's the first thing. From an ethical perspective, I wouldn't do it. And then from a pragmatic perspective, I also think if you want to help people to see that in a certain way they have been blind or they have been participating in a problematic dynamic, I think you will only make them withdraw more if you use a stigmatizing term. So I believe that from a pragmatic point of view, it's much better to use a mild term, such as just use the term mass formation, because that's a good term. Mass formation just refers to the fact that there is such a thing like the formation of a crowd or a mass in society, a very specific group dynamic. So I think that's sufficient. If we indicate a problem like that, and then from an intellectual point of view, I I do think it's always problematic to transfer terms that are used for individual diagnosis to the level of group dynamics in society. So I will not use it, the term psychosis. And meanwhile, I believe that Robert really agrees with me, and I think he used it quite intuitively, and it is often the term mass psychosis is often used. So it's not strange that Robert used it, but in my opinion, it's better just to stick to the term mass formation.
Mike, have you seen this formation happening in the intellectual circles?
I live in hotels, and so the lady was just cleaning the room very noisily. So I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I'm on my own. Yes, I don't know that I saw. I don't know that I saw a mass forming. I don't think I saw that, but I became aware that a group of people were viewing some of the same situation and arriving at completely different conclusions. As I think I famously arrived, by writing articles and doing interviews, complaining about the inappropriate use of PCR mass testing. I knew just enough about it to know that the way it was being described couldn't possibly be as accurate as it was being claimed. I'll just say, I don't want to go into that anymore. It's very boring. But it's a wonderful amplification technique. So it will take multiple cycles of amplification, and roughly every cycle it will double whatever was in there, because it will anneal and make a copy of whatever's in there. So it'll be however many cycles, it'll be 2 to the power of however many cycles. So when we talk about 25 cycles or 40 cycles, what we mean is 2 to the power 25. Scribble that down, folks, and work that out manually. And then work out what 2 to the 40 is. And it's about, I think it is exactly a trillion, 1 trillion. That's a billion in old money. And so you only need, and the lower limit of detection, as its inventor, Dr. Carrie Mullis, said, is 1 molecule. So if you've got a probe and a primer, and they should sit together, and if they successfully detect, you're fishing for something in the sample, if it successfully binds, and then you successfully multiply for 40 cycles, you can make 1 trillion molecules. Now that's a lot. And so the amount of contamination required to be able to get a signal is like one molecule during the process. It probably doesn't work like that, but you can see you only have to have one molecule that sticks to the primers that's available to the reaction sometime during the 40 cycles, and you'll get a signal. Well, come on. Now, if you've got loads of tubes, even in a flow hood and a careful worker, what chance is there that you have really excluded even that level of contamination? The answer is no chance. So I knew enough to know that what they were claiming for it, basically they were using inexperienced graduates who'd never worked in a lab, who had to be trained how to use a pipette. And then they were shoving 2 of them at a time in a flow hood where the flow will be disturbed if you have more than one person in it. And then, so I knew that the numbers were nonsense, or at least they couldn't be relied upon. And yet that's one of the 2 great deceptions, I think. As Mattias was saying, the statistics are not right. So one was to confuse a positive test with a case, whereas historically we would start with symptoms and then try and work out what was wrong with you. Whereas now we start often with people with no symptoms and declare that they are a case, and worse, a confirmed case. That sounds really grand, doesn't it? It's just a positive test result. And I think the other big lie, and I do see this around me all the time here in Florida in sunny weather, is people walking around with masks on. Quite often, young people with big beaks on them. Those N95 masks.
It's
And
not just Florida. It's not just Florida.
I know.
It's
smile
everywhere.
pleasantly, wave goodbye, wave hello. And sometimes, if I'm stationary in a queue or in a lobby or whatever, I ask them, may I ask, good day to you, may I ask, why are you wearing a mask? And they've no idea. It's just become unconscious.
No, I think what I was alluding to when I said intellectual circles, and maybe Mattias, you could, answer this, but how is it that supposedly smart or intelligent people fall for the same formation that you speak of?
Oh, well, first, for about 30% of the population, probably about 30%, the corona measures, such as mask wearing and vaccination and so on, really have the psychological function of a ritual. And a ritualistic behavior is behavior that has no pragmatic meaning at all, and that demands a sacrifice of an individual. By participating in a ritual, an individual shows that its own individual interests are less important than the interests of the collective. And that's why rituals always are a kind of behavior that demands a sacrifice of the subject, such as this sacrificing children, for instance. So, and if you look at the phenomenon in itself, then it's clear that intelligence doesn't play a role. To the contrary, the more, you have intelligence and you have education. And at least the more highly someone is educated, the higher the level of education, usually the more vulnerable people are for mass formation. And that's because our education and our training at school maybe learns us more to think as everybody else than to think for ourselves. So that's one thing that has been described by such scholars as Gustave Le Bon and Canetti, Freud, McDougall, from the beginning of the study of mass formation. And there's another way to look at it. If you look, I've been describing since more than a year now how the process of mass formation emerges in a society. And what you see is this. What happens in a mass formation is actually that all the psychological energy, all the anxiety, all the energy is attached to a very small set of mental representations. So, and that makes that the field of attention becomes very narrow. It is as if people only see the virus and the possible dangers associated to the virus, for instance, and that they are completely blind for all the collateral damage of the corona measures, for instance. So that is this famous narrowing of the field of attention. So that means that for a person who is in this process of mass formation, the only reality that exists is this small part of reality that is indicated by the narrative.
Yes.
By the mainstream narrative. Which means that at that moment, let's compare it to a computer. At that moment, the computer of the person just has no other data available than what is
Mm.
indicated by the narrative. It is the only data, the only information that is charged with psychological energy. This means that no matter how powerful your computer is, it cannot work with data that are
Mm.
not available in the system. And that's
Mm.
the problem. That's the
Mhm.
problem, that you're dealing with people for whom the only data that are available in their mental system is this small part of data that is indicated by the narrative, and that is in line with the narrative, because the other information is just cancelled out, which means that intelligence has no impact at all on this process.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating because I just before you spoke, and I didn't answer your question, Germ, about have I seen intellectuals forming, as it were, really exactly as Matthias described it, except I would have described it wrong because didn't understand what was happening. But yes, people I'm still very friendly with, so I engage in conversation.
Mm.
I literally can't. Yeah, I mean, you've described it perfectly, Matthias. I've often tried really kindly to say, we've discussed this, you've told me this. Could we just do one thing? Let's focus on one particular feature. And I think they're unable to do it. Unable to do it. So I was trying to direct a friend to discuss with me asymptomatic transmission, and I tried 4 or 5 times by writing, and we were on the phone, and I actually couldn't find out. It was almost like trying to put a pin through a globule of oil, and it just kept moving. And I don't think they knew they were doing it, and I didn't know how to steer them, and it was just completely unsuccessful. And I said, "Well, it's nice talking to you, and speak again soon." So yes, I have seen it, but I hadn't understood. Yeah, I still don't understand. Um, and it's very important because there's this old saying: never attribute to whatever it is, malice, that which can be attributed to incompetence, something like that. So it's almost the equivalent might be never ascribe to evil that which can be ascribed to this narrowing of focus. So as Matthias says, the people who are caught in this and can only see the narrative and things in line with it, they're not evil. They're not evil.
No.
They're caught in a process. So, but the people who have made this happen, they're evil. I've no doubt in my mind. These people knew what they were doing. They're very skilled at the things Matthias has described, and no doubt much more.
We've seen the process of mass formation became increasingly strong throughout the last 2 or 3 centuries. And this simply has to do with the fact that throughout the last 2 or 3 centuries, the number of socially isolated people is always increasing. And just before the crisis, it reached a highly problematic proportions, because like the US Surgeon General in America mentioned that there was a loneliness epidemic. Over 50% of the people mentioned that they had not one meaningful relationship, that they only connected through the internet. In the UK, Theresa May appointed a loneliness minister. And if you really have to look at it like a chemical process. If there are a lot of socially isolated, atomized people, Hannah Arendt calls it atomized individuals, all these isolated elementary particles suddenly reconnect in the process of mass formation. And the more people there are that are socially isolated, the larger the process of mass formation is, and then also the longer it lasts. And the free floating anxiety is one aspect of it. It's also something that you should. I almost see it in my mind as a chemical process. All this anxiety that is not coupled to a representation suddenly, with the speed of the lightning, connects around the globe with the same mental representations. That has been described by Canetti, by several people who always were were so surprised to see how fast it happens. And once it happens, the process, all these people that are connected in the mass formation, they share the same ideas, the same kind of thinking, and also they often use the same words. And it's something that is very hard to explain and to understand from a mechanistic uh, 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 view on man in the world, because it happens so fast and so in such a strange way that everybody who has been studying has remarked that it is almost incomprehensible how fast it goes. And then also, like, even at the physical level, if masses join, if a crowd joins, it has been observed that actually it's very hard to explain how these people so suddenly find each other in the middle of a city, for instance. It seems as if they come from everywhere and they all join this group. It's the same that you see in starling swarms. When a starling, the phenomenon of starling swarms, when it starts,
Yeah.
suddenly the starlings come from all directions, they join each other, and they start to move as if they are one organism, as if they are the
Sure.
cells of one organism. It's something that is extremely hard to understand, and when you only take into account when you only look from a mechanistic perspective,
Mm.
or that it is a.
Yeah, but is there relevance in humanity for, let's say, religion or spiritual belief of some sort? And if there isn't, where do they find that meaning?
So I don't want to get too confessional.
Mm.
But I was brought up, in southeast England in the beginning in the 1960s. I call it the dying embers of sort of organised, mostly Protestant religion, I guess, Christian religion. There were signs were all around me. I lived in a classical village that had grown up, I guess, from the medieval era until eventually it ended up on the edge of a dual carriageway. um,
Mm.
it had one very old church, several grand houses around a green on which um, cricket was played in the summer, three pubs, one for the middle classes, one for the working classes, and then one on the edge. Lots of small shops. And so as a young boy, I used to enjoy being part of the church choir. Most people were either a Boy Scout or a Cub Scout, um, or they sang on the choir, or they did something on the edge of the cricket pitch. Almost everyone was part of a community, and my little bit of the community up to about the age of 10 or 11 was like we would go choir practice twice a week, and then we would do a wedding on a Saturday usually, and then we'd do two services on a Sunday. And I lived about half a mile away, so I'm just popping out to do the choir. It was great. I loved it, and I fell in love with the canon of that sort of English church music and the hymns and the psalms, and I never paid any attention to it. It was just there as part of the environment. And I think, in a way, without being very religious, I would bow my head. I would listen to what the preacher was, the vicar was saying. Anyway, long and short of it is, I think it provided some stability, which I wasn't thinking of, and I think we, at our peril, unfortunately, just allowed these rituals that were so useful just to fade away, and they've gone. And I now live, well, until we left England, we lived in a different village. No one attended the church except for people who were like older than 70. Anyway, so I thought about this formally last year. I thought, I wonder whether I have substituted for religion the sort of organizing process of the scientific method. I would think about my world as the extent to which things could be thought about objectively. I wondered, have I substituted all my life the scientific method as somehow superior? And then what happened during 2020 was it was crushed underfoot. What I was doing and offering to people was rejected, completely rejected, and I would be attacked. And I remember one day saying to my wife that I've got nothing, because the method I think I've accidentally used all my life, the scientific method, is no longer working, and I've got nothing. And I found I was quite alone for a few months, and then I don't want to get too grand about it. I suppose it's a lowercase f. I kind of found faith again. I was kept bumping into things that reminded me of something 50 years ago. You can hear I'm getting a bit emotional. Yeah, I mean, I think what it's done for me is provided me with the strength to carry on, and that's what I'm navigating to. So I don't know. I think, Jeremy, if you asked the question again, but I can tell you, if I didn't have faith in humanity, I would have quit. But it's not organized to a particular religious discipline. I'm not in anything. I just think, maybe it's also, if there's something as bad as evil, then there's something as good as holy. So I'm going to point myself at that. That's what I'm doing. But
Mattias?
I don't go to church now, and anyway, I'll quit. Yeah, it's nice.
Well, you know, I could answer or try to answer your question from many different perspectives. But maybe I will start with also something on the personal level. Um, when I was about 16 years old, I started to become interested in philosophy and I started to read a lot of philosophers such as Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, and so on. And for a few years, I was convinced that the universe and was actually nothing more than a mechanistic machine. And to me, it seemed incomprehensible that someone could suppose that there would be something like a god in the universe, in that universe. And I mean it. For me, believing in something like God was close to being mad, because I couldn't see what else the human being and would be than a biochemical machine. I didn't like the idea. I didn't like the idea, but my way of thinking or my brains told me that there couldn't be another option, that the universe and the entire world and the human being included was all part of one large mechanistically functioning system of elementary particles. And something that could perfectly be described like Laplace, the famous French mathematician, said, something that could be completely understood in a rational way and could be described in mechanistic terms. And it took me from I continued to study the sciences and to read some popular books on quantum physics, and I slowly started to understand that the world, that science actually doesn't tell us that the world is a mechanistic system. To the contrary, that the great scientists all concluded that materialism actually doesn't hold, that there is no such thing as elementary uh, material particles who exist independently of the human mind. That was the first crack in my mechanistic worldview. And then later on, much later, I was about 35 years old, I think, when I started to make myself familiar with complex dynamical systems theory. And then I really started to understand that the world and what we call the facts, that they are not only not mechanistic, but that they also are not rational. They do not behave in a rational way. The human mind, the human mind is fundamentally not capable to understand the behavior of the phenomena of nature. And that was the moment for me. That was really a moment in which I felt liberated from the idea that I could understand everything in a logical and rational way. And I suddenly saw it there before my eyes. The people such as Edward Lorenz really showed in a mathematical way, which seems like a paradox, and it is a paradox, but they showed in a mathematical way that complex dynamical systems behave like in an irrational way, in the way they have the structure of an irrational number. And people like Niels Bohr said that uh, the only way to say something about atoms, about elementary particles, is through poetry, he said, because
Sure.
he was well aware
Wow.
he was well aware that there is that the world and the things cannot be grasped by our rational mind. And that for me was slowly from then on,
It's profound.
I started when I looked at nature, when I looked at other human beings, I suddenly knew that I should not start from the idea that I would ever be able to reduce them to the categories of my own thinking. And that was something. There were other things as well. But it slowly, I believe, moved me in the direction of a more mystical view on man and the world, and that created a space and where I could experience what I believe was the original, the seminal religious experience, the contact the contact with something that is bigger than you, the being aware that there is a knowledge outside of you that is much greater than your own knowledge, and
Mm.
that the true knowledge is not inside yourself but is outside yourself. And for me, that is the essence of what all really seminal scientists have come to tell us. They all arrived at the same conclusion. They did not arrive at a superior rational knowledge. They concluded that our rational knowledge is extremely limited, and that if we really want to get in touch with the world and if we really want to know the world, we should move to a different way of knowing, which has much more to do with a capacity to feel empathy with the things we see and we study, and to resonate with the phenomena outside of ourselves. And that's where we get in touch with the spirit, I think, that is
Mm.
eternal and it is much, much bigger than we are. I believe that totalitarianism is identical to the belief in the illusion that there is a theory that is complete, that is total. That's exactly the ultimate meaning of the word totalitarianism. It means that you believe that your own theory, be it a race theory such as Hitler's, or be it a materialist, historical materialism, as what Stalin believed in, but it's the belief that you have a theory which is total, and you have a fanatic belief that imposing this theory to society will lead to a new uh, uh, society in which the human being is liberated from all its limitations. That's exactly what we see in the contemporary transhumanism, in the contemporary technocratic idea. It's the idea that starting from a rational understanding of the human being, we can overcome its intrinsic limitations, and we can create like a future paradise. But Hannah Arendt said that the only problem with the paradise of the totalitarians is that it looks like hell, and and in the end, and that's exactly what a human being that believes that his own rational understanding of the world is the basis of everything, and that he can try to control and manipulate the world starting from his rational understanding,
Mm.
always tends to create to destroy all humanity, and to end up in a catastrophic dystopian society. Um,
Mike, in your scientific community, which I know you are um, a member of, can you see a parallel between the 1600s witch hunting?
Oh, yes, yes, in the sense that I mean, I've not read about it in detail. I probably read, a page or two in my entire life, so I have an impression of it that for some reason, some people thought that some young women were channeling, bad spirits, and that some people thought, well, if we can stop this happening, we'll, save ourselves. And so there were all these trials, and people. I don't know how many it was, but quite a number of people over a few years were killed in this horrific way. Um, and then gradually people stopped believing that, and it fell into history. Um, yeah, it is funny you mentioned witch burning. A friend of mine, I won't mention him, but good on him, another scientist formerly in industry, had been asked by one of these fact checkers about me, and he'd refused to comment about me. And he said, "You know what? Your inquiry sounds to me like witch burning." That was the only thing he said. If you want to quote me, that's what you can quote me saying, nothing else. So he was not necessarily agreeing with me, but he was agreeing with you, Jim, that it was not a proper balanced inquiry about what was going on here, and he wasn't going to commit himself one way or another. But he's clearly spotted that process going on. And yeah, the more you try and help people, the more likely you are to get chucked onto the fire, unfortunately. But the what I've started thinking about is just to ask people when I've described some things that I think are wrong, that, and it's not you're wrong. I'm saying what we have been told is wrong, and I'm trying to sort of stand by the person and point, as it were, what are you seeing? And I think sometimes I do get through, and other times I don't. So the question I've started asking is, have you believed anything I've said? If I have, what's stopping you from acting? Is it you don't know what to do, or you're fearful about the consequences of an action? If you disagree with me, then let me know that, because maybe I'm completely mistaken or whatever. But one thing occurred to me very recently, and this was very helpful. I remember having some professional coaching when I was probably in my early 30s. I mentioned sort of anxiety, and somebody had commented that I seemed to know what to do, but I wasn't doing it. And of course, the reason was quite often we don't do things because we're frightened. It's quite frightening sometimes. To move to action is fearful, and it's often very easy just to not do anything. So the question I've got for people is, if you've believed anything I've said and you haven't acted, is it perhaps because you're frightened? And so the question that really opened life up for me was, Mike, what would you do if you weren't afraid? It's just such a disarming question. And of course, I immediately said, well, I'll do A, B, and C. And he said,
Right.
well, do it. And I didn't do it the first day, but I would return to that very often, that question, what's holding me back? And it's usually because I'm anxious, fearful. And I would say to the people that know something's wrong, I'm asking you, I'm imploring you. I think you have an obligation to at least ask questions, to raise some doubts. That's all I'm going to ask you to do. And if you're frightened, please do it anyway. They're not going to execute you for asking a question.
That's right. Yeah.
Not at the moment.
But you've just made me consider a question, Mattias. Maybe you can answer this for me. So last time, Mattias, you were on my podcast, I was taking antidepressants because of anxiety issues. Now I'm been off for many, many months, and I'm in a much better headspace, and thank goodness for that, right? Here Mike mentions that he suffers from anxiety. So now in this conversation there are three of us, two of us of whom suffer with anxiety issues. How is it then that we don't fall prey to that mass formation?
Oh, and I immediately want to add that I have my fair share of problems with anxiety as well. I think that anxiety is one of the core aspects of human experience, of the human condition. So everybody is anxious, but we have a choice in how we deal with it. And we can try to deal with it by hiding us in the group and by conforming to certain ideals that circulate in the groups we belong to, or we can try to handle it by speaking out. Because speaking out, if you speak out, that also gives you a certain strength and backbone. And that also is a way to deal with anxiety. I often feel that from time to time here throughout the corona crisis, I became anxious as well. And then I always noticed that at the moment in which I started, I decided to speak out in a sincere and as honest way, without trying to go against someone else, or without trying to impose my own ideas and opinions to someone else. I always felt that the action of speaking out in one way or another made the anxiety disappear, or at least made it lessen. But throughout this crisis, I don't have been very anxious, I must say. I have never been anxious for the virus. I've been anxious a little bit for the consequences of the societal the dynamics in the society. I've been a little bit anxious about that, but always I decided to just try to contribute to the solution of the problem. And I think as soon as you really do that, you feel that at least the crisis makes sense and is meaningful in a certain way, and in that way the anxiety disappears. So or at least it decreases. And yes, so that's one important thing, I think. It's not indeed every human being knows anxiety. Human being that does not know, that is not confronted with anxiety, that would be something really strange, I believe.
Yes. I think, Mattias, you've made a really good point about how moving to action is to an extent cathartic. It doesn't fix things, and yes, it can certainly get you into a whole heap of trouble. One of the things that characterizes many of the people speaking out, not all of them, and I would say particular kudos to the people who were still in official roles, because honestly, the system punishes in many times people who are in official roles and go against the narrative. But because I was semi-retired and drifting along as a sort of occasional consultant to exciting young companies, I could do what I like. Now, what I was going to say, yes, I agree with you that speaking out is somewhat cathartic, and so again, that's on my question to anyone who's listened to anything I've said and thinks, "Oh, I understood that bit." Well, if you don't speak up about it, why don't you? And if it's because you're frightened, please do it anyway, because two people here have just told you when you do that, you actually feel a lot better. So,
But
yeah,
can
I feel, yeah, I just wanted to say that it won't matter how many interviews I do, it won't make any difference. I've said this on a few interviews, I'll say it again. I think the concept of the resistance relay is really important. So, if 10 people, as a result of listening to this podcast, begin doing something, even if it's just, I'm not sure I believe what they're telling me anymore, something as simple as that, it will be worthwhile. But if they just say, "Oh, I'm glad these guys have got it," no, we haven't got it. There's nothing we can do to stop this. You can stop it. We can stop this collectively. I can't do anything.
But can I play devil's advocate and say to you that, okay, I'm going to speak out, but that means now that I'm going to possibly lose my job, and that's going to cause me more anxiety?
Yes. Yes. You know, Jeremy, that the better you understand the true nature of mass formation and totalitarianism, because mass formation and totalitarianism are very much related to each other. But the better you understand the true nature, the more you see that what is really dangerous is being silent. Because in the end, if the dissonant voices stop to speak out, then the totalitarian system always becomes a system that devours its own children, to use a term of Hannah Arendt, and nobody will be able to see how to escape that danger. Definitely not if it is a worldwide system as we are confronted with now. So the only real means to defy and to resist the destructiveness of a process of mass formation is by speaking out, because it is a kind of group hypnosis. It's a phenomenon that is very sensitive to the voice. Totalitarian leaders understand that very well. They start every day with half an hour of propaganda because they know, intuitively or consciously, it depends, that the population is in the grip of the voice of the leader, and it is the voice that keeps the process of mass formation going. And the opposite is also true. If there is a different voice, a dissonant voice in public space, then this hypnosis is disturbed. And people might be angry because they are very intolerant to dissonant voices. But the masses might be angry, but still, the hypnosis will become less deep. And that's the only thing that can prevent the totalitarian system from becoming utterly absurd and radically cruel and committing atrocities. We have seen this in history time and time again, in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, in the 1935 and the Soviet Union, that at the moment there is no dissonant voice anymore. At the moment the opposition is silenced in public space, that's the moment where the system becomes radically cruel in an absurd way. Nobody can predict then what will happen, and nobody can predict who will be the next victim of the system, because that's what, well, I will not go into detail. I have discussed this in other podcasts, but I mean, it's much more dangerous to be silent than to speak out. That's what we all have to realize. And we do not have to speak out starting from the conviction that we are the only ones who know the absolute truth. What everybody has to do is to be as honest as possible and just tell what, to the best of his own reasoning, is true in this situation. Not because he's sure that the other one does not know the truth at all, but just because here inside he has the feeling that this is what is true. That's what we have to try to do as human beings.
To your question, well, yes, what happens if I speak out and maybe I am dismissed? You are right. I think there are certain people who, by virtue of their role, would be declared as bringing their organization into disrepute, almost if they said anything at all. But that's not. I think that's not true for the bulk of people. If there was a doctor that spoke to the UK Health Secretary, Mr. Javid, a couple of days ago, and nearby were 4 or 5, people in, I think, nurses' garb. I don't believe a single one of those would be fired just for saying, I'm not confident we're going in the right direction, sir. Could you reassure me? I don't think so. I mean, if they wrote a paper on it and said, they're all lying like I've done, they almost certainly would be fired. But so what I'm saying is, if you're not speaking out, even though you've heard from McCulloch, Malone, Yeadon, and 20 others, if you're not speaking out, is it because you don't believe them, or is it because you are frightened? Noting that two of us have said there's a cathartic value in just saying something that's truthful, and maybe at whatever level you can. I think, Mattias, you may have used the phrase, or I invented you saying it, was like dropping seeds of doubt. If the lowest level would just be to ask a question, it might be to say, I don't really feel confident we're doing the right thing anymore. I could understand it in March 2020, things like that. So no, I don't think anyone's going to fire. I don't believe anyone's going to get fired for asking a single question, dropping a little seed of doubt. All I'm doing is asking people, if you're feeling some fear, I think you'll get some catharsis even for doing that. Because there isn't an answer to the question. If you say, I just don't feel confident what I'm being told, someone can't say, no, it's all perfect. They also, as Mattias said, there isn't a rational explanation for many of the rituals. So I mentioned earlier that I often will just ask people, may I ask why you're wearing a mask? And they usually just look at me uncomprehendingly. I don't think they know.
As I said, the better you understand what's going on, the more you realize that there is no other option than to speak out and to demonstrate according to the principles of non-violent resistance. That's extremely important, because as soon as imperialism set in, and then after imperialism, totalitarianism, it has been remarked by different philosophers and psychologists that by far the most effective way to resist such systems like totalitarianism and imperialism is through non-violent resistance. Because if you understand the psychological, that's something completely different than a classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship, non-violent resistance would not be effective at all. But in a totalitarian state, it does, because the nature of the psychological process is such that every violence used by the minority who resists the system will be used as a justification to move to commit atrocities. So that's very typical. You can describe this in a very detailed way from a psychological point of view. But so speaking out is the first ethical obligation, I think, because as a human being, there is something, as a human being, the essence of a human being is very much related to the act of speech. As when we stop to speak our truth, that's how it is. It's specified in the Talmud. When we stop to speak our truth, we slowly lose our soul. And I do believe so. I believe every time you really succeeded in saying something which you really believe is true, which you feel inside of yourself, which you feel that resonates inside of yourself, when you bring this to someone else, when you give it to someone else through words, and you see that it arrives there, that is the moment when we start to really exist as a human being, when we have an experience of existence. And that's at the same time exactly the opposite of totalitarianism, because totalitarianism destroys the existence as a human being. And that's really, you have to take this literally. Totalitarianism imposes an absolute, total discourse to society in such a way that an individual cannot make choices anymore. And it is exactly at the moment an individual makes choices, in the first place, choices at the level of speech, in which it has a space where it can formulate the worlds as it prefers them to be formulated. That's the moment where we start to exist as a human being, and we have to use this space time and time again. Even if it is very small, we have to use it. Try to speak, and everybody can do this in his own way. And we don't have to do this without any uh, tactical awareness. We can be careful, and we definitely should be honest and polite and sensitive to the reactions of other people. If other
Right.
people get angry, we should be careful how to deal with them, and we should always keep in mind that maybe to a certain extent we might be wrong ourselves. That's also possible, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you just try to speak out those words that are born inside of yourselves and of which you feel that they are true. That's the only thing that matters.
And not trying to create division unnecessarily.
Indeed.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Mike?
One thing,
Yeah.
yes, just I guess almost final things really. Um, I remember early on during the crisis, I had this feeling that if I could like get a stake in the ground that was strongly enough anchored, I could hold on to that and pull people towards my view of things, and they would go, oh, yes, we're making a mistake, and we could quote go back. But I think listening to Mattias and also thinking about my own world, I don't think I want to go back. Yes, I prefer this hadn't happened. But if I could navigate from here to somewhere else, the last place it would be was December 2019. My life was pretty good, but I could see it could be better, and I could see that it could be better for most people. So I think to go from here to something better, that's a genuine wish. I don't know what it is, but that's a genuine wish. So what I'm saying is I'm not advocating to go back to where we were. So, in a sense, that's an offering to people who didn't like where they were before. I'm not your enemy, and I'm not trying to push you back there. I didn't like it either, and let's go forward together to a place as yet undefined that we feel is better than what we had before. That's what I want to do. But I want to divert us from this course that I worry we are on, which I think will be right through the gates of hell.
Data doesn't really convince or change anybody's mind, because they'll just say, well, you're getting your data from that place and that's fake news or whatever it might be. So there's obviously a different way in which one needs to engage, and I don't know what that is. And so I'm asking, what are some of the tools that you have found to be effective?
Yeah. I would say I'm in the early foothills of answering that question. I'm not a proponent of, as it were, being able to persuade people through methods other than, I mean, often, as you may have seen, I'm not really a detail person, which is quite an admission for a sort of quantitative scientist. But I've never liked the detailed numbers. I understood the broad progress of often of say a biological function that might be described mathematically, but I hated trying to solve it mathematically. It was so painful. But I understood the concepts quite well, or at least well enough to understand what the implication might be for, say, pharmacology or toxicology, and it worked well enough, so that was good enough. And I would often lead in that way, trying to inspire people to come up with new ideas or to challenge their own ideas to see if they were robust enough to become a new drug project. And so that's what I'm starting to do now. So I don't really have good answers to your question, but I'm learning in humility that the tools I've got, that my view of the world is sufficient to convince me that we are being lied to, and I now understand. I do think I understand the motives of people that designed this, and I'm not criticizing the people who've fallen for it, because it's easy to do. So I don't have a good answer to the question, but I think Mattias, the objective he described, which is to speak out sincerely, and say what has come into your head in that situation. Being a little careful not to, don't want to step out in front of a truck, as it were, career-wise, but ask questions sincerely or make observations sincerely. My wish for people is that there's a little bit more talkative. We often will be inhibited standing in a line or in a crowd, and that's understandable, and most of the time doesn't really matter very much, but it does matter now. I think if you start an exchange, a polite, friendly exchange with people in the street, I think you'll be surprised at how often it's extremely rewarding. That's all I would say. I generally have found, when I ask people, and I always ask, do you mind if I ask you this question? Because if they don't want to speak to me, they'll say, well, they'd be quite abrupt, and I put my hand up and walk away. So I would say, yeah, start. Be very polite, very respectful if you're intruding in someone's space or even ask them a question that you've no business to demand an answer from them, but you ask sincerely and politely. If they really don't want to speak to you, then you get the point. And if they answer the question, you know, that's interesting. You know, where do you think that might be? Something like that. So I have not got. I don't have any answers. I'm making it up as I go along. But
And I want to second what Mike just said, that we should not try to convince people that they have to go back to the old normal. Because just like Mike, I don't want to go back to the old normal as well. The old normal, that was exactly the reason, with all the psychological misery and all the lack of meaning making, was the reason why people felt vulnerable for this mass formation. So it makes no sense to try to convince them to go back to the old normal. And personally speaking, I also don't want to go back. I often said that here around me. Like I remember vividly that in December 2019, there were so many people at our faculty at university who suffered from burnout, who were not motivated anymore. And I also remember that sometimes I felt helpless because of the amounts of work and all the bureaucratic stuff and so on. And I think that in a paradoxical way, we needed this crisis. But the risk is that in this crisis, people become convinced that there is only one option to create a new normal, and that it is this technocratic transhumanist new normal. And that's not true. There are other options to create a new normal, and that's what we have to do. Much more than trying to convince people to go back to the old normal, is that we have to try to construct together a new normal that is a human new normal, in which people can live a life that is worthy of a human being. That's what we have to do. Um, and that's one aspect of, maybe even more than criticizing the corona measures and what is imposed now to society. Maybe even more than that, speaking out means uh, telling each other that we don't want a new normal to be this technocratic new normal, and that you have to think together about a much better new normal.
one of the things that motivates me is my young adult children, 26 and 30 years old, and two grandsons, nearly 3 and nearly 1. If they were not in my world, I'm not actually sure I'd be doing this. In a sense, why should I? I'm doing this because I'm outraged at their loss of opportunity to even have a life. It's becoming more constrained for them. So almost whatever you say, if it's to do with trying to help children, it's like I'm in for that. That's why I'm in this at all. I don't really care about me. I mean, it doesn't make a great deal of difference one way or another. We're all going to die eventually, and maybe I can potter along for another few years or a couple of decades. But honestly, I'm not self-sacrificing. It's genuinely true. It doesn't matter that much. I could probably go to ground and have quite a nice time and escape the measures, but it's the wrong thing to do, because my children's future, and by representation their peers, and by representation large numbers of people, and I'm aware that I have an opportunity, I have knowledge and whatever it is, courage, independence. That means I can be hopefully a force for diverting us from this headlong fall into whatever.
Well, you did choose Florida. You could have done better than that if you moving to the US.
Yes. Well, I'd be very happy to go and spend a little time with some people on an island off Greece. That sounds great. But seriously, I mean, one of the things you'll be aware of is that the imposition of testing and certification as you move across thresholds, I'm afraid I don't want to start this because everybody knows what I'm going to say, but I do think that's a feature of this system. It's like a grid in the future, and if you increase the resolution of the grid until eventually it's like a meter on a side, that's probably the ideal technocrat's world. You have to wave your vaccine passport or digital ID to move from one square to another. So it makes the free movement of people harder and harder, and that I think is by design.
Mike, in front of you there's a crystal ball. What do you see?
I think that depending on where one is in the world, 2022 is going to see things get a lot worse or a lot better. I think the era of uniformity, I like to think, is over. It must be over, and that's because um, you know, although there's been a great deal of homogenization over the world, increasingly over decades, we're not the same. We form and interact with each other differently. So I think, there might be some parts of the world that will go rather predictably to a sort of a vax pass world. But I think there'll be other parts that will resist, and we're seeing some signs of that. I won't name particular countries because I'll just get it wrong. That's the reason. But so I'm hoping diversity is the answer, and I've always liked diversity. I lived a long time in the corporate system, and the thing I hated most about the corporate system was the desire from the top to sort of, as new management at board level would come in, they always wanted to make their new broom sweeps clean. They wanted things done in a particular way. And I kept telling them, I don't know what the right way of doing drug discovery is, and I'm sorry, you don't either. And what I can tell you is success is a function of the number of innovation units, at least, because it gives you the opportunity to run lots of different experiments and then capitalize on that. So I'm hoping that's exactly what's going to happen over the next year. There'll be, as it were, a number of innovation units. So there's the imposition of whatever the totalitarian system through the mass, and then hopefully a differing degree of resistance, or possibly people may cooperate in a way that diverts it from its goal. But I hope by the end of the year, instead of like a near uniformity of a grey threat, there may be strong differences, and those themselves, I think, will be useful to help people navigate. I hope that's it.
And Mattias, in front of you, there's a crystal ball. What do you see?
Well, I remember you asked me that question at the end of our first interview as well. I don't remember what I answered, but and also it makes me think about this quote of Niels Bohr, who said, "Prediction is always difficult, in particular if it's about the future." And well, what I see, what I expect, and what I expect is that more people will wake up, more people will speak out. That's something that I expect, but I also expect that the people who identify with the contemporary approach, and broader, the people who identify with the mechanistic ideology, who believe that the technocratic solution is the only solution for the problems we are facing, real problems, or problems that are to a certain extent imaginary in nature. So I believe that those people, this system, this ideology, will become more repressive. Yes, that's what I believe. I believe it might become more aggressive. It's not necessarily like that, but it might become, and that in that case, we also have to be prepared to continue to speak out. And no matter what comes, we have to continue to think as as open-minded as possible, and to try to give voice to our thoughts in an as sincere and way as possible. I don't know exactly what the future will bring, but I know what principles I will follow in the future, and that's maybe sufficient.
Mattias, if people wanted to follow your ideas, where can they find you?
Yeah, I have a profile on LinkedIn, and I have a profile on Facebook. I don't have a profile on Twitter at the moment.
Good.
Because it consumes much of my time, all these social media. And I want to write a second book. I wrote one book which will be published in this year, and in a few months. And I want to write a second book, which is about, on the one hand, truth, on the other hand, rhetorics, indoctrination, and propaganda. So people will have to miss me a little bit, on the social media, but I hope to be able to present them a second book in 1 year.
But that book is not going to be in English, is it?
Well, the first one now, which the title is "The Psychology of Totalitarianism," the Dutch version will be published, but it will be translated soon. And the publisher told me today that it probably will be published somewhere in the spring this year.
Well, I will definitely be buying a copy, and then I'll invite you back to chat about that. And Mike, if people wanted to follow your ideas, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm slightly more organised than I've been hitherto, although I'm actually quite a disorganised person, really. I used to be on Twitter, and then I kind of bailed out. I got, whatever.
Me too.
And then I had an Observer account for a while, and then the Observer became a little bit too cheeky. That is, it started telling the truth. And recently they locked me out, even though I've got almost no followers. I thought, you're completely petty. Anyway, so I decided I was going to be petty back, and just on principle, I was not willing to delete a truthful account. So I left Twitter as myself, and I don't even look at it now. I've just decided I'm not going to go there. I do have a Getter account.
Yes. What's your account there?
My handle is Dr. Mike Yeadon. That's what I am. On Telegram, my dear friend Robin Minotti rescued me really when I fell out of the Twitter window, and we've kind of collaborated ever since. So there's a joint channel called Robin Minotti plus Dr. Mike Yeadon, and those are the only two places I actually stick material out on, and then the rest of interviews, and I've no idea what you do with it afterwards. That's the sort of one of my great regrets is so maybe Jeremy, you could send me a link so I'll try and store them. Last year I did like 20 or 30 interviews, and I don't have an organized record of them, which is so embarrassing, but I don't.
Both of you on Inspiration, as always, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you for providing thank you for providing the outlet. Really, it's very important. In fact, it's very, very important. All the people who do these things, thank you so much for creating the window, and the ear, as it were, so people can hear us. Thank you. And Mattias, it's been a real pleasure being alongside you. Thank you.
Likewise, guys. Thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me, Jeremy. It was very nice to be here again.
My name is Germ. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit supportgerm.com.